Hello everyone and welcome to this video. This is the review of round 3 in the lichess 45+45 league, and we're gonna see the game of our teammate RoseCrestPrince versus TheKova. Probably I'm mispronouncing. Okay, I apologize if I completely butchered that name. So RoseCrestPrince with the white pieces opens here with d4, and now knight f6, and here he chooses to go for the Trompowsky, an interesting opening there that doesn't contain that much theory, so it is a nice choice there. Knight e4 by his opponent, which is one of the less critical tries against the Trompowsky. And here he goes for this line h4, which is a very interesting option. But it's only good if black takes on g5, but RoseCrestPrince mentioned that all this was preparation, and he knew that his opponent will get into this line with knight takes g5, which is an inaccuracy. But here I just want to mention that the best move here after knight e4 is bishop f4. You transpose it to a London system where the knight on e4 is slightly misplaced. An example line will be something like d5. And I'll use the normal London move, e3. And let's say if black strikes with c5 in the center, we go bishop d3. Now let's say there is a trade here, e4, and now knight c6, putting pressure on the pawn on d4. We will have this interesting idea, bishop takes e4, d takes e4, and now we use knight to defend the pawn on d4, and we're gonna try to play against the weak e4 pawn. It's just an example line, so he goes for h4, which, if you know that black is going to take on g5, is just the best option, because after knight takes g5, h takes g5, your rook on h1 is already activated here. You can see that it's already putting some pressure along the h file, in particular the h7 pawn. You can try some ideas like this, or bishop d3 and put pressure there. So that's why knight g5 is an inaccuracy, and maybe black after h4 should have gone for c5 here, striking in the center. And after, let's say, d5, gaining space in the center, there will be the move queen b6. You get out of this pressure because the e-pawn will not be able to move. It was pinned. You put pressure on b2 and the game continues from here. Okay, black goes for knight g5, h takes g5, and now white is just an excellent shape here. e5 by black, which is really bad, to be honest, because after is d5 and queen g5, the queen is gonna waste a lot of tempos in the opening. You're getting your queen out very early on, and after knight f3 you gain a tempo with development. The queen goes back to d8, and now just knight c3, just develop. Here black goes for d6, and Rose takes on d6, which is a slight inaccuracy. Maybe slightly better was something like e3. Just continue your development, because black can take on e5. For example, let's say d takes e5 was played here. After queen takes d8, king takes d8. This very important move, bishop c4. Playing this move first before grabbing on e5, so that there is no bishop e6. We see that we basically discourage this bishop e6 move, because we will completely destroy black's pawn structure if bishop e6 is played here. For example, let's say bishop e6 takes, and now use knight e5, and the position is awful for black. Black has lost the right to castle. We're gonna castle along. We have two fantastic rooks here on d1, on h1. The knight comes to d5, the other knight comes to b5 is just humongous position here for white. So after bishop c4, if black tries something like king e8, then we take on e5, and now we gain a tempo against the f7 pawn. Again, if bishop e6 takes, and we get the same fantastic position with the same ideas to castle long on knight e5, and we enjoyed our position here. So e6 releasing the tension very early on is not ideal. Black took with the queen, and now there was a trade here on the d6 square. Castle's long, and now bishop d7 by black, trying to stop this knight b5 idea. e4, which is maybe slightly more precise. This is not a mistake or an inaccuracy, but maybe slightly a little bit more precise was something like e3. And the point is now with a knight the f4 square to the bishop, so this bishop will never be able to give a check on f4, as we saw in the game. We're gonna see later on how this was relevant. We can play knight b5, and at some point, obviously not now because the bishop is secure in the square at the moment, but if the knight develops to c6, we have access to the b5 square, and knight b5 is gonna hit really hard on black because the bishop cannot stay away from this diagonal. It needs to defend the c7 pawn, because after knight c7 that will be a fork on the rook and the king. So e3 was maybe a little bit more precise. He goes for e4, which is also not completely terrible, cannot be bad. You're preparing to develop your light square bishop. Knight c6, and now we see that knight b5 here, which is a slight inaccuracy as well. As I already pointed out, there is this check on f4, and the bishop checks the king, gains a tempo, and stays keeping control over the c7 square. Once the king moves, you can kick the knight, and the c7 square is secured. So maybe after knight c6, slightly more precise with something like e5. We see that if black takes on e5, that will be a horrendous blunder. After takes, and rook e1, f6, f4, and we win a piece. So it's not a good idea. So after e5, the best move by black is something like bishop c5, but after knight e4, attacking the bishop and also defending f2, and if the bishop tries to stay keeping pressure against this pawn on f2, we can try bishop c4. Now we're threatening bishop takes f7, king takes f7, and then rook d7, winning a pawn. So we will have a very nice position here. We have ideas as well of knight g5, and it is a nice position. For instance, let's say black tries something like bishop g4 to stay away from the pressure of the rook on the d7 square. We will have something like knight e5, and we can see that there is pressure on the f7 pawn, quite a bit of pressure. There is also pressure on h7, so you cannot play something like rook f8, and it is a really hard position to play as black here. So knight b5 was played in the game, and now the check, of course, king b1, and once you gain this tempo, you can kick the knight with a6. Here he goes for g3, which is also slight inaccuracy. Maybe after a6 you can simply go back. That's one option. The engine suggestion after a6 is something like rook h4, and it is very concrete because g5 doesn't work here. You will have something like rook takes f4 here, winning quite a bit of material. For example, let's say e4, and now this is the point, knight takes e7. We win the rook. Okay, so g3 was played, and here black decided to take on b5, which is a slight inaccuracy as well. Should have tried something like bishop g3, fg3. Now we can see that both pawns on g3 and e4 are split, so they're easier targets for black to attack here in position. ab5 was played, and now gf4. bishop g4, pinning the knight, not giving any time for bishop takes b5. So rook d3 had to be played to unpin and also keep an eye on the knight on f3. And here rook a4 by black, which is a mistake. Maybe after rook d3 slightly better was something like b4, gaining space on the queen side, staying away from the x-ray of this bishop. And for instance, if you try something like it happened in the game, for instance here knight g5, black will be able to play h6, and after rook g3, h6, because you cannot take, the rook is hanging, black will have long castles here. That's the main difference, that as it happened in the game, because after rook a4 you cannot castle. In the game after rook a4, knight g5 was played, a very good move. And now if black would have tried something like h6, we will have the same idea, rook g3. And now you cannot castle long here, you have already moved the rook. So the rook on h8 is still unprotected, so you cannot take on g5. There is pressure on the bishop, and once this bishop retreats to d7, we have this very nice tempo with bishop takes b5. We win a pawn, and later we can remove or defend maybe the pawn. Maybe defending will be better, yeah. We can later remove the knight, and we will be up a pawn here in a completely winning position. Okay, so after knight g5, black goes for f6 and rook g3 here. Takes. Black decides to take on e4. Now bishop takes b5 was played. Rook takes f4. And now bishop c6. bc6, and here he decides to take on, Rose decides to take on f4, which is a mistake, honestly. Maybe just simply rook takes g5, just capture this pawn. If rook takes f2, just rook takes g7, and there is nothing to worry about. Indeed, black is the one who has to be careful. This passer on the a file is very dangerous. So rook takes f4 was played, and now g takes. What you did here is you just repaired black's pawn structure. Now this pawn is undoubled, and there are 3 against 1 on the king side. The rook is already behind the h pawn, and it's gonna run really fast here. It's gonna be very dangerous. Your a pawn is also fast, but it doesn't have the support of your rook. As you can see, this is the main difference. Black's rook is already behind the passer on the h file. Rook e1 was played here, which is another mistake, because you're encouraging the black king to go to a square that he wanted to go anyways, and your rook needed to stay on the h file here to stop black's h pawn. Maybe after gf4, a better try would have been something like a4, just launch your passer, and for instance, let's say h5 is played, we keep pushing, let's say g5, we push again, now king f7, trying to bring the rook to stop his pawn. You can try something like king c1, and if black tries h4 in order to go away from the h file and not hang your pawn on h5, black can try something like king d2, and if rook a8, we can already play rook a1 here. g4 doesn't work because there is this very nice move, rook a4, threatening to take on f4 with a check, and this rook is doing a very nice job defending the pawn here, putting pressure along the 4th rank, and we will be able to parry everything here to stop all the pawns. Also the king is coming closer to stop the pawns. Okay, so after rook e1, black of course goes king f7. He wanted to go there anyways. King c1, and now he starts running with Harry the h pawn. King d2, and now h4. There goes Harry. a4, an interesting try, trying to also run with your passer. And now here black goes for g5, which is a mistake, and gives black a chance to bounce back. After a4, Slightly better was something like h3, and we can see that the king cannot cross the file because after the check and rook takes e1, king takes e1, the king will be out of the square and will not be able to stop the pawn. For instance, let's say white goes something like king e2, there will be rook e8 check, and if king f1 or king whatever, doesn't matter, just rook takes e1, king takes e1, and now the king cannot catch the pawn. You can see that he is outside of the square. The pawn just promotes there. So after h3, if you try something like f3, let's say, black will play something like king g6, and if you give the check on g1, there is even king f5. You cannot take on g7 because the pawn promotes, so you have to try something else. Let's say a5. Now there will be g5, and after, let's say, king e2, trying to get closer to the h pawn, there will be h2, rook h1, and now this very important move, g4, trying to approach with the king, also threatening g3 to cover the pawn with this pawn on g3. That will be game over already, so you have to take. King takes, and now threatening king g3, so you have to play king f2, securing that square. And now king h3, you defend the pawn with the king so that the rook can come here to g8 or to a8 to stop the a pawn, and this will be probably lost for white. So g5, and here comes a very nice move by Rose, this f3 move, excellent move, stopping g4. You really cannot allow g4, g3, that would be really bad. And just to show the dangers of playing something else, I'm just gonna play some kind of lemon here just to illustrate how dangerous is allowing this g4 move. For example, let's play just a lemon just to illustrate. b3, there will be something like g4, and after, for instance, king e2, there will be h3. Let's say king f1, and now g3, and this is just game over. Takes, takes. These two passers are unstoppable. This will be lost for white. So f3, a really nice move. I really like this one. This was very nicely played. And now rook a8 by black, trying to stop the a pawn. But just b3. Just stay solid, defend the pawn. King f6, getting the king closer. King e2, also that's the same. King f5, king f2 here. Rook d8, trying to enter here with the rook. a5, trying to distract the rook, which he manages because this rook a8 is a mistake. Here black should play something like check. And let's say after king g1, trying to stay closer to the h pawn, black will go something like g4 here. After f takes g4, king takes g4. This is a very dangerous position, and white needs to be very precise. King g3 is a serious threat, threatening to give mate here with rook d1, and also tying the rook to the first rank. The rook will need to stay on the first rank to defend these mate threats. This will be a very dangerous position by white here. So rook a8 was played, slight mistake there, and now rook a1, the rook behind the passer, nice move. h3, and now a6, trying to keep that pawn to be as closer as possible of queening. King e5, and now b4, king d4, and now rook a3, trying to stop this king from entering to c3. King c4, now king g1, trying to become into Pac-Man mode here, taking all the pawns here on the king side. Black takes on b4, and now rook a2, king b5, and here comes a7, a brilliant move here, because black can enter the king and pawn game. Let's say that black will try something like king b6, there will be king h2, and now after takes, the king and pawn game is just won. Let's say king takes, king b6, king g4, king c5, takes, king d4, takes, king c3, king e5, takes, push, 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 and take queen. Let's say something like king d3, make a queen. Now let's say c2, queen c5, stopping the pawn, and now after king d2 there will be this check, king e1, let's say, and now king c3 check. We attack the pawn as well, so black has to defend. And now this very important check, queen d3. Now the king cannot go to e1 because you just take, and if the king comes to c1, now the king is blocking the advance of the pawn, and we use this very important tempo to approach with our king. We play king d4, and after king b2 we just give a check here. Let's say king b1 is played. Now queen b3, again the same idea. We attack the pawn, and we're also threatening to, we give the check, and we're threatening to take on c2. So if black tries something like king f1, we can simply take, because black still has the c pawn. You can, if you imagine a position like this without the c pawn, this will be a stalemate. The king will not have a legal move. For instance, let's say black tries c5, king takes c5 will be a horrendous blunder because this is stalemate. The king cannot move. So after c5, you just play something like, I don't know, king e3, king d3, or whatever. Just don't allow stalemate. Just not king c4, because that also will be a stalemate. That will be really funny. So yeah, that's the way to win the king and pawn game, and that was nicely done by RoseCrestPrince. After a7, black sees that he cannot really enter the king and pawn game, so tries something else. Goes king c4, king h2, attacking the pawn. Now king d4, takes the pawn, and now king e3, king g4, defending the pawn, and also putting pressure here. And now c5 by black, and here this is another brilliant move, rook a3, very nice, controlling all the tier rank and also defending the pawn on f3. Black tries king d2, and now another nice move, c4, and now the king is cut off from the tier rank. It cannot enter because the rook is cutting the king there. Also, you defend your pawn and you're blocking both black's c pawns. With this pawn, it's very important to keep our c4 pawn so that we can stop these two pawns from going forward. King c2, and now king g5, king b2, rook a5, very nice, putting pressure there on the c pawn. King b3, and now king takes f4. Black takes on c4, and now king e5. Now with the two passers, we should be able to convert this position. Black tries king b4 to make room for his passer. Rook a1, nice move. And now c4, and here king d5, a very nice move by RoseCrestPrince. We see that pushing the f pawn will be a horrendous blunder here. If you try something like f4, that will be even losing after c3, and let's say f5, c2, f6, and now there will be this very nice move, rook takes a7, deflecting the rook from the defense of the c1 square. You get rid of the white passer on a7 with tempo even, because you cannot take on a7. That will be another queen here on c1, and it will be completely losing for white here. So that's not a good idea to push f4. Of course, RoseCrest goes for the best move here, king d5, very nicely done. c3, and now king c6. This is the idea. The king wants to come to b7 to defend the pawn on a7, hit the rook, and once the rook moves, you're threatening to promote and win the rook for the pawn promoted. Black goes c2, and now king b7. This is the idea. Now the rook is free to leave. It does no longer have the responsibility to stay defending the pawn on a7. Rook f8, and now a new queen has brought. takes, king takes, obviously, because the rook has a responsibility to stop the c pawn from promoting. King b3, and now rook h1, c5, king b7. And during the game, I honestly thought that pushing the f pawn was the winning plan, but my teammate found the right way to win. I suggested a bad way to play there. After c5, if you try something like f4, that will be a draw. That will be a blunder f4. For example, let's say something like king b2, and after f5, you make a queen here. Takes, takes, and after f6, we just push. f7, c3, f8 queen. Now we push again. And now if white, let's say, gives a check here, we will have king b2. Queen e2 trying to pin the pawn, but now there is this very nice resource by black here, king a1. Now black is threatening to queen his c pawn, and if white takes on c2, that will be a stalemate, as we saw in the earlier line. See here that queen takes c2 will be simply a stalemate, and it is just a draw. This position after king a1 is just a theoretical draw. So that will be a way to to spoil the position. Not a good idea. f4, but my teammate finds the right way to win this position with king b7. Now the idea is to come as closer as possible here. Once the rook, for example, let's say, imagine the king here, and once the pawn is pushed, you take, and this king is gonna be responsible for stopping the other passer, and the rook is gonna be responsible for stopping the most advanced pawn, sorry. Okay, so that's the plan. Now c4 was played, king c6, okay, getting closer. c3, and now king c5, much closer. King b2, and this is the idea I mentioned, king c4. Now, when black wins, you just take, and after king takes, you pick up this cherry here on c3, and that's what happens in the game. After c1 queen, you just take, and take this pawn, the f pawn, use queens, game over. So a very nice game here by RoseCrestPrince. I really like how he played in the endgame. That was very superb technique, honestly. So I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.